Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the newest episode of Marios History Talks. I'm your host, MariosHistoryTalks, and we have a great show for you today. And the response from the last episode was overwhelmingly positive, and I am so happy you enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed putting together and doing all the research. And today we have another great episode for you that I think you're really gonna appreciate. So before we get started, definitely take a moment now to like, comment, and subscribe down below. Make sure those post notifications are turned on as always. And of course, do follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We are there. A lot of exciting content being posted there as well. So with that out of the way, let's get talking. So one of the most common negationist tactics that we hear hurled against our identity is that our language, essentially being a Bulgarian dialect, was just artificially Serbianized in the 1940s to draw it closer to Serbian but away from Bulgarian. And after all, don't all those self-proclaimed experts on Quora remind us that the joke in Bulgaria is that Macedonian was a Bulgarian dialect typed up on a Serbian keyboard by the communists? Yikes. And also, they're going to remind us that the documents and all the correspondences from revolutionaries and writers are also written in what essentially amounts to modern-day literary Bulgarian. After all, weren't our languages much closer, if not one language, before those dang Serbs got a hold of it? Okay, bro Chacho, calm down. Now, first off, I'm very impressed by your ability to regurgitate what you've literally been told your whole life by news media and Božidar Dimitrov interviews, and doing so at a very respectful 8th grade reading level. But unfortunately, that's not how any of this works. So before we get started, a couple of things to make abundantly clear here. The idea that any language, except for maybe Esperanto or Klingon, is artificial or fake, that falls flat in the face of linguistic science and language development. Which is good for the people that make these claims because they're also comfortably outside the realm of science themselves. But just a reminder, the international consensus outside of Bulgaria and Greece, consisting of Slavists and linguists alike, affirm the autonomous status of the Macedonian language written in the Cyrillic script from the southeastern group of Slavic languages and descending from the Old Church Slavonic, which was in turn first codified based on the dialect of the Macedonian Slavs around the Salonika hinterland. And secondly, the naming of a language historically is not any objective indicator of its linguistic classification. It's an indicator of the time and historical circumstances in which the people and the language were thought of. Throughout history, Macedonian has been called everything from Slovenski, Makedonski, Nashinsky, Starinsky, Bulgarski, Srpski, and for my Greek homeboys out there watching, it was also called Dopia, which means indigenous. And of course, this is nothing unique. Many languages historically were labeled or associated with another more established or more prestigious language. Look at Rusyn, Salatian, Pomeranian, Palabian, Montenegrin, and most recently, Ukrainian. Been watching the news there? But lastly, as another example, let's not forget Greek, which was historically labeled Romaika well into the 20th century. And now we can do a whole episode on what modern-day linguists actually have to say about the Macedonian language today, but that's not the point of this conversation. What we do want to do is just take a look at some examples of pre-codified spoken Macedonian, so you can assess exactly how close or far it is to our modern-day language. So let's look at this chronologically, and you can hear the natural spoken language in Macedonia over the centuries and compare to what we're currently speaking today. So you ready? Let's get started. So first up here is going to be the Macedonian Lexicon of the 1500s. Yes, you heard that correctly, the 1500s. In the 16th century, a high-ranking official of the Roman Church, the Vicar Sylvester, on his way back from Jerusalem to Rome, passed through Macedonia. To rest a bit, he actually stayed in Kostur for a short span of time. And with a lively interest in the people and the environment in which he rested, he wrote down a number of words and sentences from the everyday speech of the people of Kostur, and he saved them for posterity. And with that, he created what can be thought of as the first Macedonian dictionary. At the same time, listening to the people of Kostur singing in the evening, he also recorded 3 folk songs, which are the oldest preserved Macedonian folk songs in existence. But that's for another episode. Upon his return to Rome, the vicar Sylvester donated his records to the Church of St. Peter, and later the manuscripts were transferred from the library of the Assembly of the Canons of the Church of St. Peter in Rome to the Vatican Secret Archive, where it was discovered in the 1940s and subsequently became the subject of a research article from the University of Paris and their Slavic Studies Department in 1958. Now, what's interesting about this compilation is that it's in the local speech of the Macedonians, but written through Greek letters. The author does label the language Bulgarian, but given the time period and the Macedonians' position in the former Bulgarian Empire and the theme of Bulgaria, this should not be all that surprising. But let's take a listen now and see how much you can understand Macedonian from the 1500s. Gospodine brate, da si zdrav, da si prost, ostavi ne da spime, ela da jame, I da pijeme, dolo da pojdime, da rabotime. Imate hljabo da kupime? Imate vino da kupime? Od koja strana da pojdime vo Bogasko? Incredible. I understood every single word. Now, among the words listed in the lexicon, we also have the various food words like vino, krusha, meso, sirenje, as well as animal words like marave, golubi, ovci, kozi, as well as one peculiar word, galhutsi, which is of course the archaic pronunciation of glufci. What's interesting about that, though, that is the Macedonian is the only Slavic language in the world to have that word for mice, whereas most Slavic languages have a derivative of the word mish, just like our neighbors. And this is something that's a bit of a linguistic mystery, and it's been preserved in the Macedonian language from at least the 1500s, if not further. Absolutely incredible. And next on deck here we have Daniel Moscopolitas, who was an Aromanian from Moskopole. Now, as a proud 1/4 Aromanian myself, who also happens to descend from Moskopole ancestrally, I want to take a moment now and speak for the wider Aromanian community when I say we apologize for Daniel. We really do. So please, remember Pitu and Toshe when you think of us, not Daniel. Now, with all that out of the way, why are we so hard on him? Well, he was an important 18th and 19th century Aromanian scholar, who among other things was a strong proponent of the Hellenization of Macedonians, Albanians, and Aromanians even, his own people. And to accomplish this, he created a 4-language lexicon primer to instruct the students in the Greek language so they can, direct quote here, prepare themselves to become Greek and leave their barbarian language behind. Daniel, tatsulafe, my man, tatsulafe. But out of this mess, some good was left. We're left with a dictionary of not only Aromanian, a dying language in need of preservation, but also the spoken Macedonian of the Ohrid region from 1793. Now, as before, this was written from a Hellenic perspective. So Greek was referred to as Romaika, Aromanian was referred to as Vlachica, Albanian Alvanitica, and Macedonian Vulgarica. But hey, this doesn't confuse modern scholars outside of Cora on what this language actually was. Macedonian. Macedonian. But anyway, let's have a listen. Господ стори небото, земята, слънцето, месечината, звездите и средне полея морето, езерата, реките и сватоя рибите. Пак рече и излекоя горе на земята свите дерва. So, the only word I personally didn't recognize offhand there was polea. Now, this is something my parents, as well as my baba, did know. It's just an archaic word for commanded. So, still very much in our speech, albeit a little bit older. And at number 8, we have the Konnikov Gospel. This was dated anywhere from the late 18th to the early 19th century. What this was essentially was a gospel lectionary written for Sunday services, but unique in the fact that it was bilingual, written both Greek and Macedonian, though Macedonian was, surprise, surprise, written in Greek letters. The manuscript was thought lost for more than 100 years and was rediscovered by a Finnish historian and philologist in 2003 in the library of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria. After analyzing and transliterating it, it was deduced it was printed by one Pavel Božigrobski in Solun, 1852, based on an earlier version from the late 1700s, and it was written in the local Kukushvoden dialect. Now, keep in mind, some of the nuances of the pronunciation style would have been lost as it got conformed to fit the phonology of the Greek language, but this is what we get. This is from the famous intro of the Gospel of St. John, chapter 1. So we have Ut pervu bishi rečta, I rečta bishi sos Boga, I Bog беше речта. Воа беше ut pervu sos Boga. Сите работи заради нисликардијата са чинија, и без него не се чинија никој од колку се чинија. Уф него беше живот, и животот беше светот на људито, и светилото ув темнината свети, и темнината не го разбра. So, the only word that you might not recognize there offhand is lakardiata. Though my parents once again certainly did, it's an Ottoman Turkish word in origin, and modern Macedonian means like joke or phrase, but in the archaic usage we take it to mean word or the word of God. And next on deck we have a literary work representing one of the earliest works of Macedonian literature. And it's dedicated to, guess who? Mr. Alexander the Great, under the title Preschazanie na Golem Alexander. It was published in Venice by a Hieromonk monk who simply called himself Athanas the Macedonian, and judging by the dialect used, it can be deduced this was from the southern parts of Aegean Macedonia. And if we read this intro, you can see he clearly had a sense of Macedonian consciousness. Even in the early 1800s, he refers to Macedonia as his fatherland, and he says that he's writing in the language of his fatherland. And like many other examples, it too was written in Macedonian, but using the Greek alphabet. Also worth noting that like other pieces of evidence Bulgarians don't like, they have also decried it as a forgery. How shocking. Now, let's actually read some of it. 3 дни и 3 ноќа цар Александар стопуваше од треска. 3 дни и 3 ноќа негов големиот ашкер се соберуваше околу од палатот со жалање и мерак. Третиот ден царот ближува на смрт. Нарача да остават ашкерот да го види и да го видат. So, very morbid start to the story, but I'm sure you understood most of it. Okay, and at number 6, we have the brothers that need no introduction, the brothers Milonov, those supposedly proud Bulgarian patriots who had to pay the Bulgarian Vasil Cholakov to get a measly 76 songs from Bulgaria proper to actually be able to use the word Bulgarian in their anthology title to not upset the Greeks. And those same proud Bulgarians who clearly didn't give any damn about any actual historical Bulgarians in history, but instead chose to focus on ancient Macedonians and medieval Macedonian emperors, saints, and rulers. Yeah, those two Bulgarians. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of this, since there is a whole video on this that you should watch, hint, hint here. But you know who actually did watch this? The descendants of the Milonovs. And they actually loved it. They sent me out an email about it. But more on that later. What we should remember here is that the brothers Milonov, writing in the 1850s and the 1860s, wrote their poems in the local Macedonian vernacular, the Ohrid-Struga region, a far cry from the eastern dialects that become the basis for literary Bulgarian. Here's some samples of what they wrote. The first is, of course, the folk story of Alexander the Great seeking the fountain of immortality, as told to them by literate Macedonian peasants. Incredible. The second is, of course, an oral poem and song. So we have Tsar Alexander сакаше да ходит да земите безсмртна вода, но кој одеше, никој не се враќаше назад. Зашто дури да стигнит некој до неа, требаше да патуват 3 дни все ношна темнина, во која луѓето се закистеха и не можеха да се вратат на Белден. Цар Александар зеде со себе си колеби и ждребина. Spoiler, I'm not going to ruin the rest of it, so go read it. And next we have actually a folk song recorded from the local villagers. This is from the Ohrid-Struga region. There we have Прошата се дона, решета се она. По поле широко, по дроми широки, кај дрво јаворо, под дрвото седе. Седе лудо младо, од далеко вика, вика се провика, врни ме се доно, врни ме се мила, немој ми се иди, овде под дрвото, оти ке загинеш, млада и зелена. Again, basic Macedonian. I'm sure all you Ohrid speakers out there know exactly what the dialectal words were, but I had no problem understanding that. Okay, so Yorigi Pulievsky at number 5 here. Also a man that doesn't need much of an introduction. Writer, revolutionary, overall badass, and one of the first defined voices pushing for a distinct and autochthonous Macedonian identity. One of his contributions to the cause, in addition to literally fighting for the Macedonian Uprising of 1878, is his dictionary of 1875 called the Dictionary of Three Languages, which is a conversational phrasebook composed in a question-answer style format in 3 columns written in Macedonian, Albanian, and Turkish, all using the Cyrillic script. So what we see here is not only the first attempts at standardizing a Macedonian language, but we also hear traces of his native Galičnik dialect seep in there as well, which makes this all the more interesting. So, in a beautiful excerpt here, he states, Narod se velit, ljudi koji se od jedan rod I koji zboruvajet jednakov zbor, I koji živuvajet I drugaret jedan su drugi, I koji imajet jednakvi običaj, I pesni I veselja, tije ljudite I vikajet narod, a месото во кој живуваат, народ се велит од чеството од тој народ. Така и македонциве се народ, и месото нивно е Македонија. Chills every time I read that. Absolutely beautiful. Definitely check out more of his work. And moving right along here, we come to Krste Petkov Misirkov, or if his name was translated in English, Chris 5 Turkey. Only really high IQ people will get that terrible joke. But moving right along here, what you know about Kriste Misirkov already. He was a Macedonian philologist, a journalist, a historian, and an ethnographer, and one of the first to scientifically put forth the reasons for the standardization of a Macedonian language based on the central Macedonian dialects, as well as the recognition of a Macedonian national identity, with interests separate from their neighbors. What you may not know about Misirkov, though, is that he was born in Pella, Aegean Macedonia. Yes, the father of the modern Macedonian literary language was born in Pella. I truly wonder what dialect of Greek they must have been speaking for 3,000 years. Crazy. But anyway, here's some excerpts from his landmark work on the Macedonian matters published in 1903. Секој човек, како член на некоја општина или некое другарство, имат известен долг и известни права кон и од нив. Народот не е ништо друго осим едно големо другарство, основано на крвно сродство, на општ произлез, на општи интереси. And then we have this lovely little passage that I like to talk about. Македонци, време ет да се убедиме, оти лошиот демон за Македонија не ет никој друг осим Бугарија. Ете зашчо поскоро требите да одделиме интересите наши од булгарските. Тоа го барат од нас благо разумието. You hear that, people? Greatest demon of Macedonians is Bulgaria? Crazy. I wonder why he thought that. But you hear his work, you hear the words he's using, absolutely the same as what anybody from Prilep to Bitola down to Lerin would still be speaking today. And that you mentioned Lerin, let's talk about another example here. Moving right along, we have the Abit. So, the Abit was a Macedonian language primer, which was published in Athens in 1925 as a result of, get this, the Greek recognition of an ethnic Macedonian minority in its borders after World War I. Whereas they stated to the League of Nations, the Greeks, the population of these villages knows neither the Serbian nor the Bulgarian language, but speaks nothing but a Slav Macedonian idiom. Keep in mind, though, this wasn't Greece actually being halfway decent in its treatment of its minorities. Far from it. In 1920, the League of Nations initiated the signing of treaties relating to the protection of the minorities in a number of European countries, which specified the obligations of the states in providing minorities with civil and political equality. On August 10, 1920, such a treaty for the protection of the non-Greek ethnic minorities in Greece was signed between the great powers and Greece. It was named the Treaty of Sèvres, and it guaranteed that the minorities in Greece should be free to use their mother tongue in their personal and official relations. The result of this was, of course, the Abit, which was described by journalist Nikolaos Safiris in the Greek newspaper Eleftheron Vima as a reading book for the children of the Slavic speakers of Greece, which was, direct quote here, printed in Latin characters but written in the Macedonian dialect. However, the Abit never actually reached the Macedonian children. It was only used as proof by the Greek government towards the great powers that they had in fact fulfilled their obligations set forth in the Treaty of Sèvres. And after that, books were later confiscated and burned. Though the strong outcry from Bulgaria and Serbia for not using their language in the books also complicated matters, but thankfully not all the copies were burned, and we can still read its contents, a wonderful Latin Bitola dialect for us to read today. So here we have Jas odam so radost na skolija. Na skolija se molime na Gospel. Daskalo ne uči da zborvame, da pejme, da pišime, da brojme i da igrame. Ali ni deca slagat i daskale i fali. Daskalo ni kažat mnogo ubaj raboti. Za ručko završvame skolija i so radost odime doma. Beautiful. Alright, moving right along here, coming to the end, we come across Kocho Ratsin, Macedonian author and social activist who's one of the pioneers of modern Macedonian literature. As an activist, he often focused on the plight of the laborer and the peasants in his poetry to draw attention to their exploitation. His collection of poems, White Dawns, or Beli Mugri in Macedonian, was published in 1939 and is considered to be the first literary work in the modern Macedonian language. Here is a sample from that collection. Stani si utre porano, dojdi si večer podocna, nautro radost ponesi, navečer taja donesi, aj pusti daje, pust bi ostanal život kućeški. Rodi se čovek, rob bidi, rodi se čovek, skot umri. Skotski cel život raboti za drugi tugi imoti, za tugi beli dvorovi, kopaj si crni grobovi. Nothing to say but wow, chills. And of course, in addition to his literary prose, we also know how Ratsin would have communicated in his everyday correspondences as well. Here's a letter that he sent to his family in Veles on September 10th, 1936, for us to also read here. He says, Dragi Aleksandar, eve da ti se javam s ovoja karta. Kako si doma i kako je majka i drugite? Si igraš li i se sećavaš na mene? Eve ja ti pišujem, ama i ti da mi pišeš. Reći i na majka da ti dade jedno parče od tija što ti gi prativ da si kupiš nešto. Pozdravija majka, Koleta, Veca, Grozda, Trajka i Angelina. Moja adresa, Kasa Korektor, Pravde, Beograd. Tebe mnogo te ljubi, Kosta. And for number one here, no particular order, chronological of course, we'll be reading a poem from the Macedonian revolutionary writer and poet Kole Nedelkovsky, who was a member of the Sofia-based Macedonian literary circle and often wrote about the suffering of the Macedonians under occupation. He typically wrote in the Skopje-Veles dialect, and the following is an excerpt from his collection On Foot Around the World from a particular poem called Glasot od Macedonia. We'll just be reading the first couple of stanzas here. O trajte, trajte, tirani nerni, dosta se tija lagi i zloba, pakosten glas odusite gadni, nad mojot narod u svakoja doba, ta, ete veke vekovi celi, piška i stenka od volci gosti. Za brata vijat koj da godeli, zda mu gloda suvite koski. So, again, pretty depressing themes there, but what is our takeaway from all this? Well, first of all, we can see how remarkably preserved the Macedonian language has been, literally going back to the 1500s. And we have heard dialects from all across geographic Macedonia, from Skopje, Veles, Bitola, Lerin, Voden, Kukuš, Ohrid, Galičnik, almost all carbon copies of the language that we speak today, which is why the codification of Macedonian presented no challenges to how most Macedonians were already speaking by that era. And secondly, if you compare the living, spoken, breathing language in Macedonia that was spoken and compare that to Bulgarian, you can see why so many Macedonians resisted the codification of a Macedonian-Bulgarian literary language based solely on an Eastern Bulgarian dialect. I mean, you can see why Kuzman Šapkarев claimed that no one knew the Eastern Bulgarian vernacular well enough to actually be able to speak it. And even as a sign of protest, he had the residents of Vresen return back the Bulgarian language textbooks because he simply did not see them fit for use. And you can also see why Grigor Prlichev in his autobiography claimed that despite his best efforts, he could never quite get literary Bulgarian nailed to the degree of becoming a professional. And outside of this, you can also see why parents were becoming worried when their students were coming home from extricate schools and they were simply not fully able to understand them as they had before. And again, you see this language called Bulgarian historically, but you look at the cleavages that started forming as soon as the very idea of a unified literary language was suggested, using only Thracian and Mesian as a basis, you can see why separation became the natural result. Again, Bulgarian label simply outlived its usefulness and could not adequately express what was the living, breathing reality in Macedonia. И затоа, другари, е премногу важно да продолжуваме да го користиме нашиот македонски јазик секојдневно. Гледаме колку богат е и колку е вкоренет во нашата историја. Кога го користиме македонскиот јазик, не само што им даваме глас на нашите предци, но исто така зачувуваме тој оган за што се бореле, за македонштината. Иако не зборуваме сите перфектно. Јас, на пример, како битолчанец, мене природно ми иде да кажам нешто како преге чупето што го бенисам го љуфна чикмако. Ама, тоа е во ред. Во нашите диалекти, во начинот како што зборуваат нашите родители и како што зборувале нашите баби и дедовци, таму е богатството на нашиот јазик. И најважното нешто е што се трудиме. Јас, на пример, ќе се потрудам да ставам повеќе видеа и објави на македонски јазик. Вие што ќе правите? Пишете ме долу во коментарите и да ми дајте идеи. Меѓувреме, јас ќе почнам да истражувам за следната епизода и ќе се видиме пак за скоро. Пазете се и не прекинувајте да се борите за Македонија. Голем патриотски поздрав. Пријатно.